I'll kick things off with some intros. My name's Melissa, and I work here at Prevalent in business development. And today we have a few returning guests. We have our content manager, Thomas Humphreys. Welcome back, Thomas. Hello, hello.
Hello.
And we have one of our solutions engineers, Sophie Pothecary. Hey, Sophie.
Hi, good afternoon.
And last but not least, we have Scott Lang. Scott's our VP of product marketing, and he will dive into how Prevalent may be able to mature your TPRM program more towards the end of the session. So hello again, Scott.
Hey, Melissa.
And as a little bit of housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded. As you can see, you'll get a copy of it and a copy of the slideshow. So don't worry about taking notes or anything, and use that Q&A box for those questions. Without further ado, I will hand things over to Thomas as he'll show us how to implement key NIST controls for TPRM. Go ahead, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And yes, very good morning, afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So my name is Thomas Humphreys, and together with my colleague Sophie, we're going to be walking you through the NIST SCRM process and approach, and taking a wider look at the standard and how we can use it to adopt a wider TPRM success and success stories as well. As this is indicated, obviously throughout the presentation today, if you have any questions, please just load up the Q&A box with your questions, and then towards the end of the presentation, we should have some time to answer them. Just first, a very brief introduction about both of us, particularly for those who have perhaps are new to these presentations and webinars. So my name is Thomas Humphreys. I've been with Prevalent for 5 years as the content manager, so helping to build and develop frameworks based on various standards and best practices. And prior to this, I worked as an auditor for just over 10 years, specializing in ISO standards. So great to be here. Sophie.
Thanks, Thomas. Lovely to see you all today, and thank you for joining. My name's Sophie Pothecary. I'm one of the solutions engineers here at Prevalent. I've been with the business around 2 years now. And really my primary focus in day-to-day activities is to support in translating how our technology assists customers develop their programs. And historically, I've worked in a kind of customer success capacity to help that maturity element of programs across our customer base and previous roles as well. Thanks, Thomas.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So let's kick off looking at what the agenda is for today. So we're focusing on the CSCRM in risk management. What makes a successful risk management platform, and we're doing a deeper dive into some of the key critical success factors that the standard outlines, and that we feel best represents some of the core directions that you need to go in. If you're developing a program for the first time, or if you've already got a program, you're looking at best practices and areas to maybe focus on or to refocus on. We'll then start to look at defining and implementing some of these key controls that NIST alludes to, and aligning that with the 800-53, so the cybersecurity controls as well. Anyone who's familiar with NIST knows there's a lot of close collaboration and close link between their standards. Before doing a short summary to say what are the key next steps and what are the areas perhaps we can take away from this, and we need to think about the next time we engage with our supply chain, with our third-party base, and viewing where we are now. So let's start with CSCRM in risk management. So what is cybersecurity supply chain risk management? You may see a few acronyms throughout today, so please bear with us. That's not uncommon when they're covering these type of topics. So the key piece firstly, I guess, is to state that as we've seen certainly over the past 12 to 18 months, cybersecurity risks can occur across any aspect of the supply chain, and we're seeing more and more risks and threats coming up that are impacting either single or multiple aspects of a business's wider supply chain and third party, a group of third parties. As we know, these can come from many different angles, and some of them more perhaps larger pieces this year, such as the Move It or Move IT vulnerability, has really exposed just how vulnerable some suppliers and some supply chains are. Obviously, implementing the CSCRM, the purpose or ultimate purpose is to allow organizations to manage exposure to those cybersecurity risks, principally through developing a formal approach to risk management and the risk management framework. Again, we're seeing more and more now, there are many regulators and many regulatory bodies who are enforcing TPRM and wider supply chain frameworks, and there's a wider expectation we're seeing that's coming in across various industries and sectors that's trying to formalize this. Obviously, as a result of all this, we're seeing that the SCRM is becoming an important aspect across multiple areas of the business, particularly those obviously that are interacting with suppliers. One of the key areas that we'll have a look at later on today is to see how ingrained an SCRM can be and perhaps should be, and not taking perhaps an isolationist approach in terms of particular business units or functions or roles, but a more wider approach in terms of how we can integrate this into the wider organization and organizational practices. So NIST 800-161 is focused purely on getting the best out of and developing a supply chain risk management framework focused very much on cybersecurity. And not too dissimilar to many other NIST frameworks, it is governance driven. We'll see again another acronym, but framing, assessing, responding, and monitoring risk. And this is a core or cornerstone of the 800-161 assessment or standard itself. And so we'll do a deeper dive in a few moments to look at what do these four statements actually mean. So, supply chain risk management, or SCRM, as in terms of how it fits within the wider risk management approach. So, we're looking at three key things ultimately within this standard. One of them is the focus on when you have a risk management framework, focus on a particular area, whether it's security risk, privacy risk, supply chain risk. It can be very easy to look at it in isolation and just focus on those risks in itself. But quite often, many organizations have a wider risk management framework. So one of the key aspects that NIST asks organizations to look at and to develop is something that fits across the wider business and across the wider enterprise risk management or ERM approach. Engagement across the business is obviously quite critical here as well. And again, that need to say, let's discuss how risk is being identified, is being developed, how we're engaging with our suppliers, not just from one single entity within the organization, but from all key interested parties. And obviously one of the drivers behind this and one of the areas to help build this is developing a level of culture and awareness and training and building that mindset to say we're in tune with who our suppliers are, what they're doing, what products and service they're supplying to us, but also the type of risks that we need to be aware of and that we need to manage, measure, and stay on top of. And of course, these four aspects, framing, assessing, responding, and monitoring, are all focused around the risk aspect of the SCRM. So whether it's establishing the context that drive risk-based decisions within the organization, from a framing perspective, to be able to start assessing those risks once you've identified what they are, starting to review and interpret what's the criticality, what's the type of threat and vulnerability that we're dealing with, what level of impact and any other information we need to consider before we start to take action, we start to engage with the wider supply chain process. And once we've got a feeling for how we've framed risk, identified risk, and we've assessed risk, what response are we going to have as a business? Again, do we think about how we do it within the wider enterprise risk management approach? And can we get to a stage where we can start to look at how we select, tailor, maybe implement different mitigation and mitigation-based controls? And of course, from a response perspective, this is where you can start to see areas such as NIST 853, the cybersecurity standard come into play, even other non-NIST-based management system frameworks and standards, whether it's ISO or CIS, or as I say, 853. And then finally, but not at the end all, that continual monitoring process. So how we monitor risks that we've identified, actions that we need to take, and monitoring that continual risk exposure. And on top of that, the effectiveness of those mitigations that we've identified as part of the assessment and the respond stages of development. So whether it's tracking changes to systems, tracking changes to the supply chain, monitoring where there are changes to new and emerging risks and threats, or whether we're looking at the actual controls that we've identified through the ways we've responded to the risk and how effective they are at managing and controlling those risks.
Thomas, just a quick question from myself, if you don't mind.
Of course.
So you've obviously pointed out here in terms of, how, identifying the initial criticality, understanding the types of services that a vendor, a supplier, a third party is going to be providing to that organization. That all kind of maps into, creating a successful CSCRM program. What challenges would you say that you see organizations face trying to integrate that with the wider ERM?
That's a good question. So one of the immediate issues is and obviously it would depend on size and complexity of the organization, but on the one side, obviously you have to think about, obviously we're dealing with a particular set of risks focused around third parties, supply chains, suppliers, and what they're bringing to the table in terms of product and service. And you may have other different elements managing privacy risk, health and safety risk, business risk, operational, financial, and so on and so forth. And I guess one of the challenges is saying, how do we bring all of this together in terms of a standardized approach? So we're thinking about the business's approach to identifying what's our risk appetite, what's our formal approach to managing and identifying risk, what's our formal approach to taking ownership of risk. And again, this is perhaps where the engagement piece comes into it quite neatly here as well. So that challenge of saying we've got lots of different pockets of risk or types of risk within the business. But obviously, the more we can bring that together and have a structured methodology and process, and a more logical way of how we adopt and manage these risks or adapt to these risks, the easier it's going to be. But it is certainly a challenge, and particularly if you're just starting out, and one of the obvious needs is going to be that buy-in sure. Across the board, across the organisation.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, it feeds nicely into the engagement, right? And often we hear, we're focusing on risk in this area, but actually getting the other business areas and domains to be engaged and standardized on that is a challenge. But yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So let's take a quick step back and just to have a think about what are we talking about here in terms of risks in the supply chain. I guess loosely we can break it down into a couple of areas, and again 800.161 does pay quite a bit of attention to this and does a very good job of explaining what different threats and vulnerabilities are and examples of threats and vulnerabilities. Obviously with our cybersecurity hat on, it's always thinking about specific cybersecurity risks, many of which we've seen, as I say, the last 12 to 18 months. Malware, ransomware, particularly phishing attacks seem to be the order of the day. Unfortunately, again, that's replicated over the past year or so, or further afield. But it's also thinking about any non-adversarial threats as well. So environmental-based risks and threats that could hamper the ability for a supplier to deliver its product or service as well. It's then also thinking about vulnerabilities and taking vulnerabilities into consideration when we're thinking about our current exposure and what areas do we need to be concerned about when we're thinking about the wider supply chain. So whether that's external, dependencies in the supply chain. Single source supply continues to be a growing risk and threat, and one that can always have an insurmountable impact to the wider business if they're that single reliance on a critical supplier, and for whatever reason they're unable to perform or provide that product or service to you. But of course, there could be internal risks and issues as well. I guess the utopia would always be that everyone's always cyber aware, always has the most up-to-date systems that are patched, are secure and ready to go. But as we know, in reality, there are many sectors, industries where that's not the case, and particularly as we go further down the supply chain, finding more unpatched systems, lack of maintenance of systems, lack of visibility of good cyber hygiene and cyber practices. And so all of these areas need to be accounted for and thought about in terms of when we're looking at what are the biggest risks to us when we're thinking about our third parties and the wider supply chain. And of course, 800-161 leverages a lot of the best practices taken from wider NIST standards, which is important, whether it's the NIST RMF, Risk Management Framework, so setting the scene about building a risk framework, to the 853 controls that I highlighted earlier, so controls focused around cybersecurity best practices, whether it's technical controls, organizational controls, governance-based controls, or something in between as well. So also, yes, one of the benefits of using something like 161 is it really has the almost cradle to grave, if you like, from developing a risk framework through to that continual monitoring approach. But it's important to note that there's a lot of different threats and vulnerabilities out there, and obviously the more visible and more insight we have in terms of what's important to us and what's critical to us as an organization, the easier it's going to be in terms of determining what type of controls and what type of approach are we going to take as a business.
Thomas, just on that point there,
yes.
And I think a great question actually raised in the Q&A. So thank you to our participants raising those questions. But you just talked around there the types of risks, and then what's impactful to us as an organisation based on the types of services. So one question raised is, how do you guide people on the level that services are defined? How detailed do you get in what activities are bundled into service? So short list of complicated services or long list of more activity-based services?
Interesting question. So yes, when you,
and it might help as well, I guess, in terms of I guess some of those factors, right? I guess it for me personally anyway, what we've seen is that we typically see a lot of different triggers that will then determine the type of inherent score, but also the types of services, and therefore the level of impact / the level of risk that you need to monitor. They can be things such as supplier services, data access, network access, different types of levels of engagement and volumes of contracts, etc. But I guess the question raised as well, and we've got a couple coming through, which is great. But from a guidance standpoint, is there any guidance in alignment to this standard and framework that can be supportive of guiding customers?
So, yes. So, so I'd say one of the things that 800-161 makes very, very clear is that it's built on a very structured approach from, as we'll see in a short while, from acquisition. So literally the starting point of how do you identify and to build contract and agreement with suppliers in the supply chain, through to what are the right security controls necessary when you're thinking about building into contract or assessing in terms of sort of surveys, audits, on-site remote audits, and other methods as well. So the 800, so 161 does I'd say structure it quite well in terms of almost a step process. And one of the areas we will see in a short while is taking it to a second level of foundational practice to maturing practice. So at the stage when you have a very mature, well-run sort of risk management framework. Certainly some of the areas you've alluded to, yes, I completely agree with. Having a think about what are the critical services? Once you have a familiarity with what type of service a supplier is providing to us, and then secondly, in terms of thinking about some of these vulnerabilities, where they are a single source supplier, that is a key starting point in trying to work out, should our focus be more technological around the security of data, security of information and sensitive systems suppliers may be handling for us, or are there more operational focus controls that we need to be aware of? So thinking about in terms of single source supply, continuity of service, recovery of service, formal agreements in terms of backup and storage, and those sort of areas. It very obviously depends on the type of product and service each supplier is offering. But yes, 161 does go some way of structuring that, if that makes sense, in a quite a formalized approach, or a logical approach, I should say, which I think is hugely beneficial, particularly if we're just starting out in the journey of developing a risk framework.
Brilliant. And there's two other questions that very nicely link in with each other, actually. So one of the questions is around, does Prevalent use NIST as its standard for SCRM? But also then the second question that's led into that is around, have we created methodology and determined the weights to get an overall score, which is exactly what you're presenting on screen, right? So yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on that too.
We take some aspects of NIST in our platform in terms of risk, and if you see what you can see on the screen there in terms of different ratings and criticality of risk scores. Prevalent from a risk management framework goes off of ISO 31000, which is the wider risk management ISO risk management standard, not too dissimilar to NIST RMF or their risk management framework, and using the likelihood, impact and likelihood to give an inherent risk score, and then using a formal risk remediation treatment process to help determine how much do we drive down scoring for individual risks. Can you repeat the first question? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, the first question was just around, does Prevalent use NIST as its standard for SCRM?
So one of the things we do is we have, I mentioned part of my role as content manager, so I help develop frameworks, and one of the drivers has always actually been NIST, given how structured it is in terms of that determination of identifying risk and creating a logical path through to risk treatment and mitigation. But we use it quite heavily in terms of many of our information security frameworks as well. So we use a blend of best practice from NIST and ISO along the way.
Yeah. And we do have one more question that's just popped in. Apologies. Just one
sure.
more.
No, go ahead. It's fantastic.
So does CSRM detail expectations in terms of roles and responsibilities from a functional perspective? So the role of procurement, the role of GRC, audit, etc.
Yes. Yes, it does go into one of the things that I like personally about 161 is, sometimes you'll get standards that will detail in areas such as so procurement and acquisition, for example, and it might give you quite a high level view of what's expected. One thing that's nice about 161 is it does take the time, and this forms part of their critical success factors that we'll see shortly. It does take the time to go into a lot of detail in terms of there should be clearly established roles, there should be expectations in terms of the purpose of that particular function and some of the key tasks that you need to think about. So it does offer a lot of helpful guidance in terms of, particularly if you're not too sure as well, saying, well, how does the acquisition, for example, then link into the wider risk framework or link into contract management or so on and so forth. So it does go into quite a granular view, which is, I guess you should take every standard with a pinch of salt, but it offers, I guess, a lot more detail than other frameworks, which is good, which personally I think is a very good thing, a very positive thing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So Let's now go into the weeds, as it were, of CSCRM, and particularly focusing around these critical success factors that are defined within the standard. So it highlights 6 key areas, and I'll spend a bit of time going through each one before taking a wider look at the relationship between this and 853. So, turning success within a risk management program. So I say NIST defines 6 critical areas. Firstly, how you adopt cybersecurity and cybersecurity practices within the acquisition process itself. So looking at what acquisition activities are critical to make the CSCRM program a success, but what aspects of cybersecurity need to be embedded within that program from the get-go. Supply chain information sharing, and how you can gain a wider view of threats and vulnerabilities and new and emerging risks when you're looking at knowledge management and wider cross-organization or cross-party sharing. Training and awareness, again, something we touched on at the earlier stages, that building that culture of awareness and the importance of understanding supply chain risk and how business ownership extends to multiple interested parties within an organization. SCRM key practices, or CSCRM key practices, and this is where the foundational, sustaining, and mature controls or mature activities sort of come to the fore, and I'll explain what each of these mean. It does go through in quite some depth in terms of how you get from that foundational stage of we're just starting out, we're just evaluating suppliers now, through to we've been doing it for a long time and now starting to build in maybe automation or different practices to help us sort of leverage and understand more about what risk means to us. Number 5, capability implementation measurement. So getting to the stage where we've developed a framework, we're starting to engage with suppliers, and what early measurements can we take or can we identify that's going to help us make business decisions around are we managing risk in a correct fashion, in the correct way. And then finally, resource. Looking at resource from a strategic perspective, from a goal-oriented perspective, whether it's personnel, whether it's budgets and finance as well, but thinking about the need to have or put aside dedicated resource to ensure that successful SCRM that we're hoping to achieve. So there's 6 key success factors that the framework defines. And so we can start to look at CSF number 1.
Thomas, just a quick one before we do that. We've got a couple of generic questions before we get into the critical success factor details. One question came through on the Q&A in terms of, are you quantifying risk using the FAIR approach, so factor analysis and information risk, to generate probability loss distributions and measuring loss exposure against risk tolerance?
If you're referring to more from a prevalent perspective, prevalent as an organization, yes, we do use that FAIR methodology, and what we typically find is many companies that we're engaged in do look at different ways to manage sort of loss and exposure of loss to the business, whether it's from various different sort of angles, or I guess you could say from an impact area perspective as well. Again, we tend to use, we look at a mixture of best practices, whether it's from the likes of ISO and NIST and other notable risk organizations and risk standards bodies as well, to help organizations form their approach in terms of how we sort of quantify risk and how we deal with risk in terms of looking at overall probability of loss in some capacity. Brilliant.
Thank you. And one of the other questions here is just around, have you already focused on frameworks like NIST 800 SP 161, or ISO 27036 or CIS specific controls? So maybe more of a generic, more of a generic question on what we're focusing on outside of maybe just the controls we're looking at today. But have you already focused on frameworks like ISO 27036 or CIS specific controls, COBIT?
Oh, see, from a webinar perspective, we have touched on 161 before, more of a wider aspect. 27036 actually not yet. Maybe that's one for the future. But yes, it's worth considering actually. But yes, 161 we have before. I think it was about a year ago now.
Yeah, absolutely.
More of a wider approach, I think.
Thank you. And I think this may already be kind of included in some of the context to come as well. So please do just feel to pin this one. But can you speak about, one of the questions is, can you speak about high watermark and how, if possible, we can apply that approach to risk management outside of cyber?
I think that may be coming up later on, particularly when we go through to look at the tail end of 161 and 53 relationship as well. Okay, I'll keep that to mind.
Fantastic, thank you.
So let's take a wider look now, or a deeper dive into some of these critical success factors. So mentioned from the first one, we're looking at the cybersecurity within the wider acquisition process. And I stated that earlier on that one of the things I like about 161 is it goes into a lot of detail in terms of that full acquisition process and literally starting from the top down and then sort of bleeding in, if you will, or leading into other critical areas of engaging and starting to engage with suppliers. The standard splits out into two critical areas, one from a strategic perspective, so defining those security requirements, those acquisition security requirements, starting to think about what foundational elements of a risk management program we need to be thinking about. So what do we mean by this? So looking at, if we're starting to identify what type of security controls do we need to think about, what type of services are we engaging in, what type of services are we going to be procuring, what type of products and services are going to be critical to the end goal of the organization. So starting to plan the type of services that we need, that level of criticality, what context it comes from, and what's the business justification for us going out to procure and engage with third parties and the wider supply chain as well. And then starting to thinking about, in terms of those requirements specifically, well, what type of controls do we need to think about? So what relevant risk management process controls are important to us? Now, I mentioned, obviously, 161 touches on 853 and even NIST's cybersecurity framework, on NIST CSF as well. But it's also starting to get to the understanding of these security requirements that we need to start identifying, that we need to start understanding are critical to us as a business. What aspects of the program do we need to incorporate them into? So whether it's the assessment process with the suppliers, whether it's the contractual process with the suppliers, are there particularly contractual controls that we need to pay particular attention to, we need to call out from a formal agreement perspective, or when you go through the right to audit, or if we're including the right to audit within agreements with suppliers. So really looking at defining requirements across the full process, not just do we need to assess them on access controls, for example, or business continuity controls. Then we're starting to look at that wider assessment review of, well, we've identified the type of suppliers that we're interested in, the type of product and service that we need to be acquiring. We've got some very clear business justification and go ahead, maybe approval from senior management. And we've already identified the type of cybersecurity controls that are important to us as a business, or that we need to engage suppliers on. How are we actually going to engage them? What type of due diligence questionnaires are we doing from the get-go, even before we've signed on the dotted line, or they've signed on the dotted line? Are there any pre-questionnaires that we need to assess them against to understand what's their current appetite or culture of cybersecurity and information security as well? Once we've got to that stage, of course, then when we've identified through the process type of suppliers, type of products, we've identified multiple organizations, for example, and we've got to a stage, let's say, where those due diligence questionnaires have come out, have been received and sent back, and so we've got a good idea of their current level of security capability. Now we can start firming that up, confirming and validating those requirements, and looking at, well, what do we need to achieve, and again, what do we need to call out from a contractual and formal agreement perspective, before the final part of, once they've signed on the dotted line, signed that formal contract, what level of overall monitoring, not just from a contractual perspective, but overall risk monitoring across the wider SCRM as well. Don't forget that one of the areas that NIST does touch on, not too dissimilar to ISO, is this idea of a lot of continued improvements, a lot of risk review to make sure that the areas that we've captured from the get-go in terms of critical risk areas or areas where vulnerabilities are the greatest, have they changed? Are there any business or operational changes? Do we need to adjust the way we identify cybersecurity controls and cybersecurity requirements when engaging with suppliers for the first time? So it's quite, as I say, hopefully you will see, quite a methodical process, and it sort of focuses on those two areas of perhaps the strategic piece and more the governance piece, and then more of the actual process of defining those cybersecurity requirements, and where there are potential risks with suppliers in the wider supply chain as well.
Thomas, we have a question just in relation to some of the items that you've just gone through, and obviously identifying who they are and how we assess, etc. The question here is, how have we guided our clients around regarding maintaining a control library within a GRC tool, which will have controls applicable to risk and control self-assessments?
How have we guided organizations? So one of the things we will say, or I personally will say when I'm speaking with organizations is, so we've got to the stage, or hopefully we've got to the stage, well, sorry, there's two angles. On the one side, for companies that already have a very well structured set of control requirements that they're using through their GRC platform or GRC personnel, is that it's important to ask that question: how relevant are they, and how relevant do they remain from a continual improvement and continual maintenance process? And that's always a key thing I think is always worth highlighting. And it's what we typically find is we guide organizations to say it's important obviously to establish a set of requirements and control requirements that say whether it's controls for all suppliers or different suppliers based on, say, tiering or different ways of profiling and tiering vendors and vendor sizes and complexities. But it's important to make sure that the controls you're asking for these suppliers are obviously appropriate, obviously at the right time. And obviously there's various different processes you can do to understand that, particularly when new and emerging standards and frameworks come out. It can be easy to quickly look at some new topics, hot topics out there, AI, for example, IoT, other ESG, thinking about some non-cybersecurity pieces there. It can be easy to jump on them and quickly say, all right, let's send out an assessment. But it's important to take the time to look back and say, if you've got a dedicated control library, reviewing it every 6 months, sometimes more frequently, if applicable, maybe once a year, to say, are we still meeting the targets that we're trying to set ourselves in terms of having confidence that the supply chain is not going to cause us these type of risks that we've identified and that we're coming into contact with, or we may have to come into contact with. So I guess that's the approach I'll generally say. There needs to be a regular review to say, are the requirements that we set ourselves, are they met through these type of controls that we're assessing suppliers against? And where there are new and emerging risks and topics, are there new mandatory controls or controls that we need to adjust, to adopt, and to adapt to these sort of changing circumstances and changing risk areas?
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Think about the second critical success factor. So then moves on to supply chain information sharing. And we'll see across multiple frameworks, not least around 27001 from ISO and 853 from NIST, this need of building a culture of awareness, but also through the use of specialist organizations, knowledge partners, industry experts, industry bodies, making sure there's full awareness of cyber risk and that current and emerging risks and threats are being understood. And there's various ways that 8161 touches on. So the use of sharing and analysis centers, or ISACs, so methods to establish that formal approach of how we gather and assess risk and threat information. To engaging knowledge partners, there's a lot out there. Perhaps some of the more notable areas are the likes of NCSC in the UK, the National Cybersecurity Centre, or CISA in the US, who are very well-known bodies, particularly when it comes to new and emerging threats and providing guidance and advisory, whether it's to small and medium enterprises or wider sort of industries and sectors. And of course, any notable sector leaders and even regulators themselves. So there's a lot of different partners out there, a lot of different organizations that companies become members of, or just to have visibility of what's happening. And it's important to have that level of visibility and that level of engagement, so that we can suitably address and understand if there are new risk areas, if there are new technologies out, what does it mean for us as a business? Should we be concerned, or are these areas we need to be monitoring, but at the moment they're not causing an undue level of stress or concern for the business? And it's the importance of that continual monitoring and review of knowledge and risk and threat information, particularly looking at what level of threat that poses to the suppliers and the organizations we're dealing with, or the types of products and services that we're procuring. Certainly when you look at a lot of the risks and threats that have come out this year, I mentioned Move It, for example, and there are other more notable threats and vulnerabilities. We often find that there's a lot of fast-paced movement to say, right, there's a threat of this particular tool. How much do we know about? Are we using that tool? Are suppliers using that tool? If so, have they taken the necessary steps based on the recommended actions from CISA or NCSC or the original manufacturers? And so the more knowledge and visibility we have, obviously the quicker it's going to enable us to respond and to deal with those type of risks. Training and awareness. So again, this idea of building that culture, and as we can see here, 161 calls out a few different top areas within a business. So you might have people from information security, risk from a governance perspective, HR, legal teams, system software development teams, procurement teams, project management teams as well. They can all feed in to the wider SCRM plan and process. So key roles throughout the SCRM process, multiple business functions, multiple units. So 161 underlines that importance of making sure if you're building a process from the ground up, or you're just starting out, it's important to get that clear buy-in to say the supply chain third-party management is not just a siloed area. It involves, or it can involve, a lot of different moving parts and a lot of different business functions and units. And so we need that continual engagement and awareness of not only the risks and the threats that are occurring or that we've identified, but through our security assessments, our cybersecurity assessments, for example, what risks are coming up through that level of engagement, what control areas are missing from our suppliers and our supply chain that we need to be focused on. So it's that wider adoption across the business to make sure we understand that importance of what SCRM means to the enterprise, and how we respond to instance issues and risks as well. CSF4 is SCRM key practices. So I mentioned 161 touches on what it calls foundational, sustaining and enhancing practices. And the purpose here, when we look at the wider 161 framework, as you can see, there's a lot of different aspects that each one considers. So establishing that formal project management office from a foundational area, looking at governance structure and strategy, defining what dedicated resource we have for engaging with suppliers. Do we need to consider from an acquisition and procurement and contracts perspective and a legal perspective and so forth. So it's about establishing that core, dedicated, almost multidisciplinary approach and project office and team that has that governance and starts to set the scene in terms of policy, process and structure. What 161 then goes on to is looking at, well, how do we then sustain those practices that we've developed from the outset? So do we have that threat-informed security program, thinking about that awareness and knowledge teams and knowledge groups? So building on that foundational practice, can we get to a stage now where we're monitoring key suppliers and we can build in further risk management practice into contracts, agreements, critical components, maybe that focus around contingency, incident, recovery management, for example. Do we develop a more formal training program that gives greater insight into how we're dealing with or how we should be dealing with risk and issue related to our supply chain? So again, thinking about perhaps some of the more higher risk areas, such as single source suppliers. And then finally, obviously, metrics as well. Can we start to develop some form of metrics that can help us monitor the type of risks that we're receiving? And then finally, the enhancing practice is almost what you'd call, I guess, if there's a maturity level, the higher level of maturity. So we've developed some framework and the risk management framework and foundational practices. They've been working for, say, 6, 12, 18 months, 2 years now. We're very comfortable with the way we're managing our processes and practices. Just now looking at how can we enhance that. So are there metrics, are there risk profiles that we can start to gather from suppliers based on the type of risks that we're finding, whether it's tiered based risks, or if there's consistency between the type of risks we're finding with suppliers. So what's the bigger story that we can start to look at and engage, say, senior management or leadership on? And of course, automation. So looking at the full process from acquisition through to exiting with a supplier and exit agreements. Is there some level of automation we can apply from that? Some platforms, some processes to help streamline the way we develop contracts, for example? Are there tools we can use that can capture all this data, all this critical documented information, for example? So it's looking at 3 stages essentially to the full life cycle, with obviously the ultimate aim of saying we're sustaining a good process and practices, but we want to get to a stage hopefully where we can start to look at driving improvement, not just in terms of risks that are appearing from suppliers, but the way in which we manage risk throughout the life cycle and throughout the process.
And Thomas, I guess to your previous slide as well, I guess some of that training and awareness will help with the enhancement of programs as well, right? The sharing the awareness across the organization, etc. One question we have through the Q&A is training awareness applicable to all participating members in the supply chain?
To all participating members, it should be, ideally, yes. We need to look at training internally, I think, first, in terms of all those key interested parties. So mentioning some of these key players here in terms of who's developing the program. When we're looking at system development, what awareness of risk from a technical perspective should be considering, from a contractual perspective we should be considering. But obviously, when you're looking at the wide supply chain, we're not just dealing with obviously our immediate third party. We're looking at our third party and our fourth parties, fifth parties, and so on and so on. And so there may be a need to look at, well, the organizations that we're dealing with, They may have 2 or 3 subcontractors who are critical to developing that final product or service to us. And again, through relationship building and engagement, is there a level of awareness that we can bring, particularly if we're seen as leaders in that particular industry or sector, that can help not only them and that relationship, but ensure that any best practices from a security aspect are filtered down to suppliers. But ultimately, yes, the focus should at the first be on making sure we got clear understanding and, of course, buy-in from the internal stakeholders and key interested parties as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Number 5, so capability implementation measurement. So again, focusing more, I guess, if we think back to sustaining practices, looking at defined SCRM metrics, and further on in terms of sort of key KPIs and targets and things that we can assess the level of quality the SCRM is at. So measuring that efficiency and effectiveness of the SCRO program. So do we have that defined framework to assess third parties and the wider supply chain? Establishing baselines to assess and manage the third-party space. So do we need to start looking at measurements that can help us identify different tiers of third parties, what level of that risk exposure and criticality of risks are, and what they cause, the impact of those risks in terms of business operations as well, to start looking at, or can we start to build processes to measure the volume of, say, critical risks that we're dealing with, and that consistency in terms of, is there trends and trends analysis based on the type of risks we're encountering, particularly when we get to the stage when we're assessing individual vendors against, say, a known framework like 853. And then finally, using those key practices that we've identified to start to build further success criteria. So thinking about those enhanced practices to sort of track and monitor and manage supply risk, and sort of starting to build formal risk profiles, whether it's on the tiered process or a tiered level. So measures can come in different areas. If you say thinking from the effectiveness of the SRM programs, I'm thinking from the governance level. So the effectiveness of policy adoption across the company, adherence to internal and maybe even external requirements as well. If there's more pressure from external bodies, I mentioned we're finding more regulatory bodies are enforcing TPRM practices, such as the Prudential SS221, I think it is, for outsourcing arrangements, and OSFI in Canada. There's more pressure externally to say you should develop good third-party supply chain practices. Obviously, design effectiveness and operational effectiveness of cybersecurity controls. So the controls you find in 853 are important to highlight here as well. And it's starting to assess multiple measurements to identify what measurements can we use to give us confidence that the SRM is working, and working to the level that we expect as well. And then finally, dedicated resource. So identifying resource needs, taking steps to secure adequate, recurring, and dedicated funding. Easier said than done. But it's important to obviously identify, particularly if we're just starting out, what type of resource do we need that's going to help not only engage with suppliers in the wider supply chain, but drive some of those monitoring, some of that governance approach as well. It's the adoption of policy and process throughout the organization. Do we need to develop any risk platforms or dedicated risk personnel that's going to help drive best practice, to drive some of that knowledge on new and emerging threats? What level of personal expertise should we be considering? Do we need to engage external contractors, or do we have enough information internally and roles and expertise and knowledge to be able to have that dedicated team that can help manage supply chain risk? And then, of course, that need to, again, continue review. What's the level of resource we have now versus a year down the road? If we've expanded the volume of suppliers and our wider supply chain processes. If we bought new business functions, we've acquired new businesses and they're coming into the organization, do you need to expand the type and complexity or level of resource, as well as funding, staffing, contractors, platforms, that's going to make sure that we're continuing that standardized process throughout. So that continual resource review and ongoing monitoring to ensure we have that sufficient resource that can maybe handle that increased volume of supplier risk, and so forth. So we touched on the key 6 success criteria, success factors that 161 touches on. And the framework does expand each of those to go into a lot more detail in terms of some of the resource, some of the key practices that we've seen in terms of those sustaining practices or foundational practices. So those critical aspects that the procurement team acquisition process should go into. Where 161 then moves on is providing a clear baseline for establishing practices that's then aligned with 853. And so 853, NIST's critical security control standard, has in excess of 900 controls. It's quite a lengthy document. What 161 does is actually enhances many of the many security controls to include supply chain specific requirement. So it's taken 95 controls and enhanced them. For example, where there are existing controls on access or system maintenance or incident management, or personnel background checks, and it's added enhanced text to say, if you're dealing with access control and you're dealing with a third party or a supplier who may have access to sensitive information, these are the areas that we need to start considering or that you should be considering. There are additional control flow downs, so controls where requirements should flow down to further sub-tiers. So again, thinking about your immediate third parties and where they may need to, you may need to ask them to enforce additional controls further down to their contractors and their contractors, and so forth. And 2 new controls are added around maintenance monitoring and supplier inventory. It's always important to note, and this is where it can get quite overwhelming when we're looking at standards such as 853, given the volume of risks, control areas. Obviously, controls selected should always be based on the enterprise's needs and thinking about to the early stages of what are the critical risk areas that we need to focus on. Data security, physical protection, personnel security, continuity and the recovery of operations. Once you've identified that, it makes it so much easier to start to piece together those key control areas that are important to us as a business. And what this looks like in practice is these areas that we can see on the right-hand side, from access control through to supply chain risk and management. These are the control families of 853 where there's been that enhancement and where we need to start thinking about, so will third parties be accessing sensitive data, such as personal data? If so, well, do we need to look at access control? Do we need to look at media and system protection? And do we need to look at personnel security, for example, and PII? Is the development of sensitive systems performed? Or are we looking at outsourcing and looking at suppliers that are going to help us develop particular applications? If so, system and service acquisition, system protection, and system development controls will be far more relevant to us and areas that we should be focusing on. I guess a question we'll always get commonly is, are there common control areas all third parties and supply chain should always be implementing? Particularly when you're thinking about contracts, and yes, there are, whether it's incident response, the way they manage incidents and risk and business continuity. These are some of the key areas that we'd expect any company should have some visibility on and insight into what their suppliers are doing and how they're responding. So where do we go from here? Well, if we haven't already, we need to focus on how we define that structured CSCRM. identifying those key supply chain risk, and establishing a formal governance program, roles and responsibilities, practices, whether it's through acquisition and procurement to contract management, to risk assessment, through to exiting agreements as well. And formal processes that can help us monitor and manage information sharing across the business and where risks are cropping up with each supplier. And then once we've established that ongoing process of awareness, training, dedicated metrics, and analysis of threat and threat intelligence, and reviewing the overall SCRM program to see how can we tighten control and make it more effective in terms of giving us visibility on supply chain risk. And with that, I'd like to quickly turn it over to Scott.
That's great, Thomas. Thank you. I think what we'll do is open it up for questions right now, though, before I start kind of sharing just a slide for resources that might be helpful. So if you want to stop sharing your screen, maybe Melissa, do you want to open it up for questions? You guys maybe triage a few of those while we're pulling up our slide here.
Yeah, I know we are technically at like the top of the hour, but if Sophie, you want to just answer one or read off one, that'd be fine. And then while Scott gets his stuff all situated, then great. And then that'll be that. If you're still with us, thanks. You'll also get a recording of this in your inbox. So go ahead, Sophie.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So Thomas, one of the questions we got just through some of those critical factors. So I get a significant number of questions regarding risk appetite. What are your thoughts around setting thresholds?
Yes, risk appetite is a very interesting area. In terms of setting individual thresholds for defining a risk appetite, there's no hard and fast rule, unfortunately. I wish there was. First thing I'd say is the more people you can get involved in understanding what is the overall business's appetite based on the industry and the sector, where a sector is moving to, and new and emerging risk will obviously help improve that and improve our understanding of what level should we set. It should always be a continually moving process, I believe, in terms of a continually reviewing process, because we need to think about, firstly, what are the biggest risks to us at the moment? If it's data security and the use of personal information, for example, then it will make it easier for us to say we need to apply a more stringent approach to what we determine critical and high risk to anything associated with data security, for example, rather than physical security or other areas that may be important when it relates to the protection of data is maybe less of a concern for the organization. But I think the more people we can get involved to make sure that we've understood the truest extent of what the risk is and the impact it causes to the business, it does make it easier to determine what are we comfortable to accept versus what's always going to be a showstopper to the organization. Thank you.
And I think if we got time for Melissa for a couple of questions, I think there's two more, but I just want to double check before we carry on.
I do think the people have gotten their money's worth today. Also, I hope nobody paid to be here. But if you want to go ahead and, have a burning question, reach out to me on the website. I guess I'll turn my camera on. Reach out to me on the website. I'm like the chat person. So copy paste it right into the chat. I'll see if I can get an answer for you. I know Scott usually does like his little spiel about how prevalent's so amazing, and it's lovely, but I will send you a short and sweet email so you can shuffle through that deck as well. But Thomas or Sophie, any last thoughts before I kind of shut things down and we can all go about the rest of our day?
All good from me. Thank you, Melissa.
All good from me.
We're all listening.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. Our website is prevalent.net. I know some people were searching for that. So prevalent.net, the chat feature goes right to me. And thank you, Sophie and Thomas, and of course, Scott. Thanks for all those questions. I really do think it's more fun when it's more interactive. So that's it. If you want to stay in the TPRM loop, add us on LinkedIn. And that's pretty much it from us. Hope to see you all at the next webinar. Thank you, guys.